Okay. Esther chapter 5, verses 9 through 14. In Esther chapter 5, we are going through one of the most dramatic turning points in the entire story. Esther had just risked her life by going before the king. She had shown tremendous humility, deep wisdom, and incredible courage. And I think that wisdom comes in with the way that she planned the banquets. She didn't go in demanding, she went in requesting. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, we know that God is working. Even though he's never mentioned by name in the book, he is behind the scenes working, not necessarily with miracles or parting seas or fire from heaven, but through this unseen providence of what's going on with Esther, Mordecai, Haman, and the king, and the people there. And while God is in the process of delivering the Jewish people through Esther, there's another story that's unfolding. You know, have you ever watched a TV show and they have a main story that is going on, but they have these other little stories going on around it, and that's to keep you entertained. And Brenda and I, we've been watching this series, and I told Joe the other night, we was talking about it, and I said they laid several plot lines out there. Because that's what they do. They draw you in so you'll watch the next week. The story of a man whose heart is poisoned. Day by day, decision by decision, and attitude by attitude. And his name is Haman. We've talked about him a little before, but we're going to talk about him quite a bit this morning. But it says in Esther chapter 5, verses 9 through 14, it exposes a truth that Scripture teaches all through God's Word. We do not fall because of circumstances. We fall because of character. We fall because of pride, bitterness, unforgiveness, insecurity, and self-worship. We fall because of sin. If not killed, sin will kill us. This is a story of a man preparing a gallows for someone else, but doesn't know what he's building for himself. And, you know, we've heard this story of Haman ever since we were young, and it's still just as amazing today as it was years ago. Because many times, and y'all know this is true, when people plots against others, we call it karma, don't we? We use that term, don't we? We call it karma. I used to work with a guy that always said, what goes around comes around. And you know, that's a true statement. That is a true statement. So we're going to talk for a while this morning about Haman. But look at verse 9. It tells us in verse 9, it says, Then went Haman forth that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Now, Haman was happy, was of a joyful heart, because of these banquets that were taking place that Esther was arranging. He didn't realize that Esther, what she was doing, and I don't want this to sound wrong, but she had everything planned out according to what God wanted her to do. I'm not going to say that Esther was throwing the trap out there for them. She was just giving them the opportunity to fall. And that's exactly what they did. But what a scene we have. Haman has just enjoyed this exclusive banquet. Think about it. He was there with the king and the queen. And he enjoyed everything. He leaves feeling more important than he ever had before. And you know, we see that today, folks. We see it so many times. We see it in political realms. We see it in all different kinds of situations where the people thinks that they are more important than what they really are. And you know, when you get right down to it, we're all human beings. And, you know, some people may have achieved a place of higher recognition, and sometimes that's because of the jobs they have or whatever, but he leaves feeling like the most important man in the empire. He is joyful. His heart is glad. And folks, he's skipping along. His heart is full of joy. So, you know, he's living this, just saturate his life. But notice the joy that he has. It's not rooted in true joy. It is rooted in circumstance. It's rooted in circumstance. We sing a song sometimes. I think it's on page 167, and it's called Joy Unspeakable. Y'all know the song, don't you? And folks, believers truly have joy unspeakable. But for people that does not know the Lord, everything that makes them happy in this life revolves around this world. It doesn't revolve around the Lord. It revolves around this world. And, you know, I had a relative one time, not involved in church, didn't go to church or anything, and there was one of their friends that got killed. And they brought in, their friends brought in food and everything, and he said, this is just like going to church because they brought in food. Folks, that's not like going to church. That's not like being involved in the church. That's not the measure of what a church is. And we need to realize that. But Haman, he was involved in the circumstances. He had an ego bigger than Mount Rushmore. You know, he just loved the attention. His joy depended on other people honoring him. Not honoring God, but honoring him. And when we look at this, we know that kind of joy is so fragile. So he's skipping along, he's joyful, he's whistling a tune, and he goes by Mordecai. And you see what it tells us about Mordecai here. It said that when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation. Boy, it sure didn't take long for that joy to be wiped away, did it? For such a small thing, one man, one righteous man of God, a God-fearing man, refused to bow to the ruler of this world. He refused to play the game. And you know, it's amazing sometimes the different characters that you see people take on whenever they're put in different situations. Y'all know what I'm talking about? At work, you know, there's a difference in talking to the CEO of the company and talking to his secretary and talking to your boss on down the line. You address it in different ways. But Mordecai refused to play the game. He wasn't interested in the game. And Haman's joy evaporated like the morning dew. It was gone. It was gone. Why? Because pride will make your emotional life unstable. Pride makes your happiness depend on the reaction of others. Pride cannot tolerate being ignored. We see that all the time, don't we? I'm not talking bad about babies or toddlers, but don't toddlers a lot of times crave attention? And they don't like being ignored. We used to go put Nathan down to sleep at night. I'll never forget this. And we'd put him down, and we'd walk out of the room, and our pediatrician told us to shut the door. And if he cried, let him cry. Well, we did that some. We did that some. And then Nathan went through a stage where he would cry, and I would go get him. And I'd go to the living room with him, and we'd sit down in the recliner, and I'd hold him, and he'd just look up just like, I got you. Your kids ever do that to you? Well, yeah. Yeah, because they know how to play the game. They know what the game is. They know the game better than you do. And you know, we see Haman's identity. It is tied to the way that people treat him. Mordecai's identity is tied to how he honors God. And you know, there's a large, big lesson to be learned in this. You know, a lot of times we get upset when people says things about us, does things to us. We've all experienced things like that, whether it's family or in the church or we're at work, whatever. We've all seen it. We've all seen it. But I always told the people that I worked for, I remember when I went to work at Vanderbilt in collections, that my upper manager was 27 years old. And my supervisor was 37 years old. And I was 47 years old. And somebody asked me once, said, how do you handle that situation? I said, the Bible tells me to be an obedient servant. For the people you work for, as long as it's not illegal, immoral, or you know, anything, to be an obedient servant. I said, and there was a couple of other ladies that worked in our group that just fought with the managers all the time. I never fought with them because that wasn't my job. But you know, to me, it was honoring God by doing what His Word said. And when somebody asked, how do you do that? Then I had a chance to testify to it, didn't I? So, you know, the opportunities are there. So, we know this, that Haman was tied to how people treated him. Mordecai's identity is tied to how he honored God. And we see that all through the book of Esther. We also know this, that it's very difficult for those two, well, probably impossible for those two things to coexist because they are opposites of each other. You know, when you get a magnet and you try to put them together and they repel each other, that's what these two things will do. They repel each other. So, Haman, the man Haman. Let's go to verse 10, and it says this, nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. Self-control. He had it all under control. But he did not calm down. He may have been keeping it all on the inside, but he didn't calm down. He was not pursuing godliness. He was planning his revenge. He was not seeking wisdom from the people that he called, but he was seeking an audience. He restrains his actions, but not his attitudes. He restrains his mouth, but not his motives. And when we look at this, notice what happens when he calls them together. It's, you know, he calls his friends. Now, what kind of friends do you think a man like Haman would have? You know, we've heard people say that's in positions of power, well, we don't want yes people. Have you ever heard somebody say that? We don't want yes people. We want people that will stand up and disagree with us. And that's all good and well and good until it happens. And then there's something to be said. But Haman goes home. He calls together the people who will validate him. He calls together the people that will agree with him. So he wasn't interested in an opposition opinion. He was interested in people that would agree with him. Verse 11 says, and Haman told them of the glory of his riches. Well, you can kind of see the direction this is going in right off the bat, can't you? You can kind of see the direction. Folks, let me tell you about how much money I've got. Let me tell you about how much money I've got. And, you know, I've known people like that. But Haman gathers his wife and friends, and he begins listing his accomplishments. Listen to what he says. He says, oh, let me tell you about my riches. Let me tell you about the multitude of my children. And all the things therein the king had promoted him, and he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. And then in verse 12 it says, Haman said, moreover, yes, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but me. Now I'm reading this as if Haman was reading it. I know that's not the words that it uses, but it says, and tomorrow I'm invited to another banquet. Can you see the pride just dripping off this guy? Can you see the smile that's on his face? He said, let me tell you about my wealth. Let me tell you about my children. Let me tell you about everything that has happened. Let me tell you about being invited to this banquet. The king has raised me above everybody in the kingdom. Now, you know, when I read this and think about this, Haman wasn't really that intelligent of a person. Because when Esther came in, what did the king say to Esther? He said to Esther, what is your request, even to the height of the kingdom? Did he say that to Haman? Oh, we're already slipping. Looks to me like Haman's already in third place. Because the king said that Esther could have to the height of the kingdom. He said it twice to her. Not just once, but 2 times. He said, what is your request, even to the height of the kingdom? And I know that the scholars and notes that I've read talks about how that he was saying that basically that Esther could get whatever she wanted, maybe not half of the kingdom, but that was I guess a hyperbole of how strong that he loved the queen or cared about the queen. So he was willing to give her to the half of the kingdom. Did he ever tell Haman that? I don't think so. He just put him, under the king. He is reading off his resume like a man trying to convince himself that it matters. Now, we had a guy that worked, and it's not your grandson, but we had a guy that worked out at Clayton's. And he applied for several jobs. And he would go into these interviews telling the managers how lucky they would be to have him. Seriously, he would. I liked the guy personally, to talk to him and everything, and he eventually did get a decent job, but for 2 or 3 interviews, he asked, or he would tell people this, because he really, I don't think he really did deep down, but on the surface, it looked like that he was self-promoting. That's what Haman was doing. He was self-promoting. He wanted everybody to know who he was. He was reading off that resume like he was trying to convince himself that it mattered. But you notice that there's definitely something missing in Haman's life, several things. There's no gratitude, no humility, and there's no acknowledgement of God or who God is or what role God plays in his life. He was simply saying, I believe it was Mac Davis that sung, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way." And that's what he was doing. That's what he was doing without a doubt. He was saying, it's all me. It's all about me. Look what I have. Look at who I am. Pride, pride, pride. Just dripping off this guy. He had more pride. He had enough pride for everybody in the kingdom, didn't he? Yet despite all that he has, look at what it says. He said here in verse 13, he says, yet all this avails me nothing. There's going to be a lot of rich people that when they come to the end of their life, and there's already been a lot of rich people that has made made famous last words at the end of their life that it was a waste. Right? And there's going to be a whole lot more. Because they put all their faith in wealth. And when I say wealth, I'm talking about whether it's actual money, gold, lands, whatever. And if you worked a public job, you've met people like that. Every one of us has. They put everything and the importance on wealth. One guy I know, he said, I wish that I had been there more for my children, because he was always focused on working. And, you know, I've always said the greatest joy God ever gave me was 2 children. And 4 grandchildren. Yeah. It's the greatest joy in the world. But look at him. He said, all this is, and he was telling his wife and his friends, he said, all this is worth nothing as long as that man Mordecai is breathing. It's more or less what he said. That's not the exact words, but that's what he said. This overemphasis on Mordecai shows the insanity of pride. One person is not impressed with him, so everything is a waste. Do you see the picture? One person don't like him. One person won't bow down to him. One person won't worship him. You know, the plot of this story is just so magnificent. The plot of the book of Esther is just so magnificent. So, he found people that agreed with him. Verse 14. Then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends unto him. Now, you know, sometimes we read through the Bible and we forget what we read because we're human. But I didn't remember this until I was getting ready for this. Haman didn't come up with the idea. It's just like, I hate to use politics, but it's just like Donald Trump or any senator or any congressman. They're not the people that comes up with ideas. Y'all know that, don't you? They have what they call a staff. Sometimes I think it's a staph infection. Okay, so this was Haman's staff here. So we know that Haman had a staph infection for sure. But they surround themselves with people that are smart. Do you really think that any congressman or senator reads every bill that is proposed? No, their staff gets paid to do that. And they get paid big money to do that. But their staff reads that stuff. I remember back when they was passing Obamacare, and the Speaker of the House stood there and she put her hand on that 1,300 pages and said, let's just go ahead and vote on it. We'll read it later. And I'm thinking, yeah, right, whatever. But y'all know the point I'm driving here. They don't actually do the work. Their staff goes through and they find the sections that they want to focus on. And I'm not going to say I would bet, because I don't think that I should say that, but I would guarantee that there is something almost in every bill that nobody's ever read because of the way they do their business. So anyhow, Haman here, this was the suggestion. Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak you unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go ye in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And Haman, look at what it says. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Y'all know how big 50 cubits is? 75 feet high. He didn't just want to hang Mordecai, or they didn't just want Mordecai to be hanged. They wanted him to be hanged high enough that everybody could see it. You know, there's an art to building a gallows. Y'all know that, don't you? Because they know exactly, and this is grotesque, I know, how far a human body can fall without decapitating them, as far as weight goes. So Haman wasn't going to fall 75 feet, because that would have decapitated him without a doubt. But they wanted everybody to see Mordecai up there swinging. That was the plan. That was the plan. This thing pleased Haman so much. Haman looked around. He listens to this. 75 feet, higher than necessary, higher than reasonable, high enough to be seen across the whole city, so everybody could see it. Why so tall? Because Haman knew word of this would get around. There wasn't no doubt to Haman but that words of it would get around. And he wanted the attention. Pride wanted the spectacle. He wants his enemy not only to be hanged, but to be humiliated publicly. He wanted him, he loved the idea. The Bible tells us right here, it pleased Haman. He was delighted. He was re-energized. He thinks he is finally in control again. But what he doesn't know is that the instrument that he is preparing for Mordecai will be his downfall. It's how God works. Haman builds, Haman plans, and Haman exalts himself. The proud man digs his own grave, plank by plank, nail by nail. I was working at a company, and they sent in a guy to carve up and to get rid of people. The very first person he got rid of was the plant manager. Very first one. Second place that he went was to the engineering department. And I'd only worked there a short time. And I only worked there a short time, not because of his carving, but he came in to get rid of people. Do you know who the last person was that they got rid of? Him. They called him one day and said, your job's done. And he said, well, I'll come back. And he told them he would come back to the city where the corporate headquarters was. They said, no, you're fired. You're done. Karma, what goes around comes around. Or God has a plan. I believe God has a plan. I don't really believe in karma, because karma is something, isn't it Buddhism that believes in karma? That, you know, and that what goes around comes around, that's that old mountain saying. Is, you see, God was stepped back. Esther was stepped back. Mordecai was stepped back. Mordecai wasn't forcing no issues. They allowed Haman's pride to mature. They allowed sin to expose itself. They allowed the gallows to be built. They was positioning for Esther's intercession, because remember, at this point, she had not asked the king what she wanted to ask. Chapter 6, the king couldn't sleep. We'll get to that next week. You'll get to it next week. I won't be here. Sorry. And setting up a reversal only he could accomplish. When you cannot see God working, trust God. Trust the fact that God is working. Because God's always at work. And like I said, this book is magnificent because you see God just saturating this book without ever mentioning God's name.
I've seen people and heard people say, and I've even said it myself, somebody's real arrogant and prideful and whatever like that. Give them enough rope, they'll hang themselves.
A very appropriate analogy. Give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves. Exactly. You know, when we let pride control our life, we end up in the same way. And, you know, we should always be mindful that it's not anything that we have done, but it's what God has done. And you know, to me, this right here, it's just like I talk about World War II and the victories that we had in World War II that we should not have had. I think that God's still on the throne. Now, I'll be honest with you. I don't understand losing 58,000 soldiers in Vietnam. I don't understand that. But God has a purpose. God has a purpose. And I don't understand a lot of things that happens in the country today. But I have to trust that God has a purpose. And I believe God does have a purpose. Even though there are things happen that you go, you know, we do that a lot, don't we? Well, it's good to see everybody that's come out to be with us. I was going to ask today